Abbot Christopher Jamison, welcome to the Next Generation.
It's lovely to be with you, Elliot.
Why does everyone always seem so busy, and is this a healthy way to live?
Well, I think the busyness that people experience nowadays has a bit of a history. It hasn't come from nowhere. If you go back to a previous era, society was much more fixed and stable. The professionals in the world all had associations that gave them certain protections and a very nice way of life and a decent salary. The unions protected working people to give them decent living standards and decent hours of work. Now, within that context, there were obviously people who were very much struggling as well. But the majority of people lived in a fairly stable, regulated society, symbolized by the great Conservative Party slogan of the 1950s, "You've never had it so good." And there was some truth in that. So post-war Britain had begun to recover from its trials of the war, and there was a kind of growing sense of optimism, symbolized by the Festival of Britain, which was a great celebration of British culture and arts. Then, by the 1970s, Britain is starting to suffer because it's not very competitive compared to the rising economies of countries like Germany or the Far East. And so the sense that something significant had to change in Britain and its way of life was handed to the Conservative government of the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. And she inherited this challenge. And her response was to deregulate part of the culture and to regulate further another part of the culture in order to create a market where the consumer would decide. So the professional associations and the trade unions were stripped of their power to control the way of life and the way of working of their members. And similarly, institutions were deregulated to let rip a more market-focused economy. And the great symbol of that was something called the Big Bang in the City of London, where we are now, when the whole financial services industry was deregulated. And it led to a great boom. And symbolized by that movie on Wall Street, that greed is good. And so there was a sense that the market now took over and the consumer's needs would lead. And that consumer world was really quite different to the previous stable world. So at this point, marketplaces changed dramatically. The old marketplace was very fixed. The same people selling the same things in the same place at the same time. And that applied even to things like the financial services industry, where there were stockbrokers, merchant bankers, all these titles that have now disappeared. You went to one person for your high street bank, you went to another person for a mortgage, you went to another person for if you wanted to invest in shares in the stock market and so on. All of that collapsed and these mega businesses started up with great power. But the problem was that people had to work much harder in those situations with the deregulation. And so they got much, much busier. But part of the motive for being that busy was to make the money to buy the goods now more easily available to you in the marketplace. So you got people pursuing a lot of work and then also pursuing a lot of purchasing, what they wanted to buy, whether it was now more people going on holiday abroad, more people buying their own house under, the release of council housing into the market and so on. Now, there were real benefits to this. There's no question. A lot of people did end up in a much better situation. And I'm not wanting to decry the aspiration that unleashed, because a lot of people now felt they could aspire to things they hadn't done before. But we have to be clear, the price we've all paid for that is we're all busier. And I think that busyness has now become quite infectious. And it's also led to a situation where sometimes I say to people, how are you? And they'll say, oh, busy. And I'll say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And they will look at me completely stunned because that's not the answer that they're expecting. So I get them to say, well, why are you choosing to be this busy? Do you have to be this busy? And they find that really quite disconcerting. So what's emerged is a sense that two things. One is busyness is just the natural price we pay for modern life, which is an assumption I'd like to challenge. And the second one is that somehow I'm not choosing it. It's just foisted on me. And again, I want to challenge that and say, you do have more control over your life. While there have been benefits to this market-driven consumer culture, actually, we've got to recognize that we also have to learn perhaps a greater discipline within that than before, where the discipline was to some extent handed to us. And my symbol, by the way, of the change of this is there came the moment when railways used to refer to passengers and suddenly started referring to customers. And I noticed this and I thought, that's really interesting. We used to be people who were being carried from A to B as passengers. Now we're customers who pay for the service. That shift in emphasis, I think, symbolized in that change of words, has become universal.
Why do you think we've become so submerged in this sort of limbic capitalism addiction economy of always pursuing consumerism? Because I'm sure there have been situations in history where we have rebelled against these typical institutions that provide structure before. So does that potentially mean that this is just a phase that we're going to get out of in the next few years? Or do you think this is a unique point in history because of the changes such as technology that are more irreversible?
Well, I think the technology has, really supercharged this tendency because the online purchasing possibilities are just so enormous. I mean, you can buy anything anywhere at any time, and you can buy the latest version of anything anywhere, anytime. So I think that there's no question that technology has supercharged this tendency. However, there are people now who are asking questions about, are there different models of the economy to be found? And I think that they're very difficult discussions to have if you're going to be realistic. And there's some sense that, liberal progressive ideas about the economy are now out of fashion. So we're going to an even more market-driven economy with an increasingly nationalist sense about it as well. That if we focus on our own economy, we'll do better. And that's counter to the sort of post-war consensus in Europe, at least, that Europe would be better off as a united single market with growing political unity. Now, that vision is just withering in front of us. While people see some advantage to the shared economy, the notion of political union has, I think, now disappeared for the foreseeable future. So the sense that there might be alternative ways of doing this is leading in two directions. One is a greater sense of national economy, which could have some ways of resolving this. And the other direction is to say, no, we've got to reconfigure the whole way the marketplace works. And that marketplace alternative is led by people who ask very good questions like, what is value? Now, there's a fascinating professor of economics here in London at King's College called Mariana Mazzucato, who writes about value. And she says, ancient value used to be food, grain, flour, and that was what value resided in food. Then it started to move towards precious metals, gold, silver, the things we could trade with that. Then it started to move towards coins. Then it moved into paper, which promised to pay the bearer on demand, etc. And then finally it's now moved into, well, nobody quite knows where, do they? Where does our money sit when it's in a bank, when we never see a single piece of physical anything? It sits in the bank and someone's deposited my wages there as value, or it sits in Bitcoin chains that people understand even less. I suppose what happened in 2008, the great financial crisis of 2008, was some of the assumptions behind that invisible world of value suddenly collapsed. So that where you used to have separate mortgages, separate merchant banks, separate stockbrokers, you now found all of those functions in one place. And when one piece of that business went wrong, namely mortgages in America given to people who really couldn't afford them, all of a sudden the whole system unraveled because they were now all interconnected. And people started to understand why there might have been some value in those rather old-fashioned ways of separating these businesses out. Now the whole thing unraveled and people started to say, well, where's my money? Well, hang on, I had money and now you're telling me it's gone. And of course, at that point, governments had to step in and save people from mass bankruptcy, because all of a sudden, the mortgages in America going wrong was now undermining my local bank account. How did that happen? And so governments had no option really but to step in, and we've been paying back for that, on quite a large scale. And so people start to say, well, hang on, that whole system looked pretty vulnerable. It looked very solid, but actually it's a bit vulnerable. Could we reconceive ways of giving greater value to, for example, investing in infrastructure? Could we invest in better communications, better railways, better hospitals, better schools? And could we see that as actually value, as opposed to people thinking, oh, it's spending taxpayers' money and it's kind of negative, that the only thing that produces value is when a business has got profit at the bottom line? Is there another way of conceiving this and of valuing things that enhance the quality of human life for the whole of society? Now, that's a pretty complex thing to figure out, but it's interesting that people are starting to ask those questions, as well as starting to challenge some of the big institutions that were created internationally. So I think there is a rethinking going on. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be.
Well, if we take it from the macro to the personal level, it seems to me that we've become victims of our own success in many ways, and that we've started putting the cart before the horse. We think that we're too good to worry about these basic needs that are fundamental to life, like water, sunlight, social interaction. And instead we can do all of these jazzy procedures that really only yield this sort of sense that we're doing something complex, but they miss out the essentials that are going to do way more for you.
And I think that one of the things that the COVID lockdown highlighted was how much relationships and community are crucial to people's mental well-being. And what's surprising is that came as a surprise to people. But many, especially young people of your age, really found this distressing on a very large scale. And that experience has reminded us of the importance of these other dimensions. Now, will we retain the lessons of that? Well, it appears the lessons are being forgotten quite quickly, it seems to me. But that the dimension of the connections of real relationships and communities remains a very high priority in our own personal lives is undoubtedly true. It's how to translate that onto a macro scale that also gives people's lives a sense of meaning and security.
We might not be able to retain the lessons from those lockdowns, but I think the damage done will certainly be retained, and a lot of it's irreversible. And it really felt to me like those lockdowns were a tipping point. And I've noticed a change in attitude from my generation since then, that we are more aware that we do need these proper relationships that aren't just online, but we're still a long way off. And if you look at the grand scheme of things, it's still not in a good place where we're at with how much we prioritize real connection rather than superficial connection. It feels almost a little biblical that you need these different disasters to come about to nail down each of these fundamentals that we need. So you've got socialization, you have the lockdown. Are we going to have a massive drought so that we have no water? I hope not. But you talk about the consumer-driven outlook in your book, Finding Sanctuary, and I love this from you. You say, this consumer-driven outlook is dependent on some hidden assumptions. First, the assumption that there is an infinite supply of goods coming from an infinite production line. Second, the consumer will have to engage in endless productive work in order to earn the money to fund the endless consumption.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I think it means people have a sense of being on a treadmill. And as we know, a treadmill doesn't go anywhere. You're just running hard to stand still. And I think it's that sense that I'm trying to give some flesh to there, that when we're promised so much and we have to work so hard for it, the ultimate expression of this is, I'm now so tired from all of this that I need to take a holiday, and I need to work even harder to pay for the holiday. So I've got caught in a sort of loop, really, of busyness, holiday, leisure, and the leisure and all of that. They're expensive as well. And so you then get people who can't afford even the holiday, who are not busy enough, they're not working hard enough, or they're working too hard in underpaid jobs, and so on. And you've got a complex set of realities there, with one group working very hard to achieve a good lifestyle, and another group who are not working hard enough and have a very poor lifestyle. So there's a real challenge within that as to how can you create a better culture and economy that doesn't drive one group so hard and enables the other group to be busier.
People often say that happiness is based on your expectations, the distance between your expectations and the reality of your situation. Do you feel like some of this maybe can't be solved top down from big movers in politics, rather it's bottom up, and that we need to almost reset our expectations in some way, which even just saying that out loud sounds like a very difficult thing to do, because we really expect the best now, and that's a good thing. We have high standards of living, but it's odd to me that people expect to have the newest iPhone when they haven't really changed much in 8 years, or the nicest clothes, whilst not being able to afford a place to live in, which is one of the biggest indicators of something like how many kids you're going to have, is having a home that you own.
I think that this goes back to what I was saying about the 1950s, where there were institutions which pretty much everybody belonged to. There would have been, everybody would have belonged to any or several of the following: a church, a trade union, a professional association, a local community centre, a youth club, a sports team. Now, you can knock off a lot of those so that you're left now pretty much with perhaps a community centre if you're lucky, and a sports team. But those other big institutions were not just institutions which restricted you, they also supported you and would help you if you got to that position of being desperate, whether it was the local church, the local trade union, or the local professional association of whatever you were involved in. So I think that we have lost those institutions at the moment when the market economy took over very strongly. And I can see a situation emerging, well, it's already emerging, where people are, as you say, at the grassroots, creating new institutions. Now, the problem with these new local institutions, the strength is that they're local. The weakness is that they're local in the sense that they're too much at the mercy of local events, local features, which can knock them off course. And the advantage of those bigger institutions was they were very solid. Although, as we discovered in the 60s and 70s, they have declined really, really rapidly. So things like membership of political parties declined dramatically in that period because people got fed up with politicians. People stopped going to church because they stopped believing in church. But perhaps even more strongly, they stopped belonging to a church. And there are all sorts of reasons why they stopped belonging to a church. And similarly, they wanted to behave in more diverse ways. So behavior these days, as symbolized by clothing, is far more diverse. You find these wonderful black and white newsreels of the 1950s with people coming to work across London Bridge from Waterloo Station into the city. They're all dressed exactly the same. And they're nearly all wearing hats. Great change has been the removal of hats. And then you used to always put on a jacket and tie to go to the theatre. Well, now everybody turns up to the theatre in jeans and a T-shirt. So you even just in those outward ways, which have no significance in themselves, but they show that this huge diversity of behaviour is one of the reasons why those institutions were no longer considered valuable, because they appeared to restrict my behaviour. And so why should I turn up dressed in a certain way if I'm going to go to church, turn up to a union meeting, turn up to something? Why can't I just do what I like? And that unleashing of a more personal sense of my identity throughout the 60s especially, and the 70s, I think explains a lot. And so, but we've now starting to discover, I think, the disadvantages of focusing so much on the individual. Namely, there are advantages and disadvantages to an institutional life and to an individual life. But we seem to think that the individual life just had advantages. And we're now realizing, actually, when the chips are down, when things are tough, actually, I'm very exposed as an individual. And I need the friendships and the community we talked about. But also, I would say, I think people do need institutions to belong to. That's a deeply unfashionable point of view. But I can see it having a resurgence in some ways in the future.
Well, how do you balance that difference between institutions and prioritizing also having a sense of self and freedom? Because I like the idea that we're living in a free economy and we're free to buy what we want, we're free to dress how we want. But there's just this mismatch at the moment where we aren't actually getting more free because we're spending money that we don't have and we're borrowing from things that are going to affect us way more down the line. So how do you balance that desperation for freedom and a sense of being able to do what you want? And, you know, it's all often sort of expressed in this infantile, no, I want to do what I want sort of way. How do you balance that with these institutions and having those as a backbone of society?
I think the institutions have been far too slow to realize what's happening. So I'm a great believer that leadership can respond in one of two ways to new situations. You first of all think it's a technical problem. So you say, well, if you make a bit of an adjustment here and a bit of an adjustment there, so look, we'll change some of the rules of our professional association. We'll give the church a once-over and make it look more modern. All of these sorts of things are technical solutions, and they don't meet the scale of the change or the urgency of what needs to be done. Because the other way to respond to this new situation is adaptive change, when you realize you have to adapt at a fundamental level the institution to the new realities. And I think very, very few institutions have managed to adapt to that new situation. And therefore, that failure, I think, is a failure of the institution to serve the needs of especially young people. So the response has to be on both sides. The institutions have to adapt dramatically, and they don't show signs of doing that. Typically, political parties are not very good at doing it. And secondly, the young, I think, are now arriving at a point where your generation has absolutely no religious background at all, absolutely no experience of political parties, and so on and so forth, although they do read about political parties in the media and they read about churches in the media. But they are, in a sense, religiously, politically, socially, a blank sheet. And because the emphasis has been so much on individuality, so can you, your generation, be open to looking again at the institutions, provided the institutions have shown a willingness to adapt to the new reality that young people want to be free? And I think the meeting place of these two for me is the notion that, and I'm going to take the church as the only example I can speak about really authoritatively, that the church needs to learn to be good at accompanying young people. Now, that's significantly different from telling you what to do. And I suppose I'd pick up a really good analysis of what a church offers and then pick out those different elements. It offers a community to belong to.
Mm.
It offers a way to behave, and it offers truths to believe. So belong, behave, believe. Now, back in the day, people used to believe, and then they'd behave, and then they'd have a sense of belonging. This is now completely reversed.
Mm.
And young people today, the first thing they want to do is they want to belong. And I do think that's the meeting point where we said earlier, young people now, after the lockdowns, realize the importance of belonging to communities, to relationships, and so on. And the church actually is an institution with a very long history of good belonging. Now, we all know the examples of bad belonging where people are browbeaten and abused and so on. But I would say, on balance, the institution has a good experience of belonging. So what has to change in the institution is the institution has to stop a sense of recruiting people.
Mm.
So I want you to sign up here. And I want you to, pay this. And I think political parties, as an example, is I'm not just recruiting you and asking you to pay to be a member. What it needs to do, it needs to get alongside young people and say, well, what do you need? And mean the question and be ready for the answers. So in the church, what it means is being able to listen to young people, to accompany them, and to say, I'm going to accompany you on wherever the adventure of your life leads you. And through that, getting a sense of belonging. Now, that I do know anecdotally, increasing numbers of people who, when they find a church community that is able to do that for them, it's actually quite redemptive.
Mm.
That often their loneliness and isolation has led to some really unhelpful habits of substance abuse or whatever. And they find that the accompaniment of the church helps them a great deal to belong to that, which then starts to modify the way they behave. And then who knows, in time, they might come to some sense of understanding the beliefs of that church.
Mm. Benedict talks about the importance of staying with the same people, not necessarily in the same place, but with the same people.
Yes.
Because of the things you have to take on when you're staying with the same people for an extended period of time. Whereas there's this trend on TikTok and online of girls telling other girls and guys telling other guys, if you're not happy with your partner, leave them straight away. Everything needs to be perfect.
Mm.
Do you think that that was maybe just a piece of advice that was significant at the time because people were more restricted materially, so they had to stay with the same people? And actually maybe it's difficult now, but we're heading in the right direction of making sure that the people we spend our time with are perfect, and if they're not, you should leave them.
Yeah. So I've been a monk now for over 50 years with the same group of people.
Wow.
And I can tell you everything about them and they can tell you everything about me. And it is hard going. That's what we call the vow of stability.
Mm.
And it is a personal stability rather than just a geographic stability, but the geographic stability is obviously an element, a key element of it. And what you have to do is you have to realize that you think you can make other people perfect and that you can't really stay with them until you've made them perfect. And after a while as a novice monk, you realize this is a completely mad idea. You are never going to make the other people perfect. And that what you have to do as a novice is you have to let them make you a little bit more perfect. And so you have to reverse the way you think. And I think you're right to highlight that reversal of thinking is really quite tricky. Now, you have to add a large caveat to that, because if you find yourself in an abusive relationship, and we now know that the abuse, between a man and a woman in a relationship can go either way. There are men who are abused by women and women abused by men. More women abused by men, clearly. So you have to say at that point, I've got to leave. And similarly, there are some religious communities which have abused their members. and you have to leave that. So, but if you can find the right kind of community to join that is not abusive, but you may have to recognize that I'm the one that's probably got to do most of the changing. That's a really hard thing nowadays to accept. And it's really a huge act of humility. And humility is not a great seller in the modern marketplace.
How do you draw that line between abuse and inconvenience? Because I know that personally, I have certain things I want to achieve in my life.
Yeah.
I have certain goals that I want to fulfill, and those include helping other people too. So why should I not leave a friend if they're dragging me down and getting in the way of what I see as greater and more important goals?
I think we've got to draw distinctions between kinds of relationship. There are relationships with family, which is your birth family. There are relationships with partners, the kind of love relationships that you have there. There are then friendships, and then there are relationships with people who need your help, described by C.S. Lewis as the four loves. And so if we understand this as loving in four ways, then each of them has different boundaries. And all of them have some kind of boundaries. So even your birth family, I know one or two people who sadly, for their own well-being, have had to cut themselves off from their birth family because that family was really, really damaging them. And I don't mean just like, an aging parent making demands. I'm talking about, a family that was leading, in the case of one person I knew, a criminal life. And this young man didn't want to be a criminal. So he cut himself off from it, quite rightly. Then similarly, in your relationship, in your love relationships, your personal relationships, this is where it gets trickier, because you have to some extent, to have a variety of those relationships, and then knowing which is the one that might be a lifelong relationship. And that's tricky to navigate, especially nowadays. The boundaries within that are so much less that it does worry me that you can become massively involved with someone and then after 12 months realize this is not the relationship that I thought it was, and I need to leave. But you're now so entangled and maybe living together that it's very, very hard to disentangle and very hurtful for all concerned. In a previous era, you wouldn't have been allowed to get to that situation until you decided to get married. So I think that that's probably one of the hardest ones. Then your friendships, yes, again, you need to have some sets of loyalty to friends, but there may be times when a boundary is crossed, and that's difficult to know. And similarly, you have to show concern for those who are genuinely in need. But again, you've got to be careful that if you become dedicated to social work as a volunteer, that you don't neglect your other three relationships. So all the time you're balancing out these four loves in your life. And personally, I'm very grateful to have the guidance of a church to help me navigate that. Because one of the things the church provides you with is personal, moral, and social guidelines. There's a great body of Catholic social teaching about how we relate to those who are in some kind of dire need. And at the same time, teachings about how to conduct personal relationships and how to honor your father and mother, to use the ancient term from the Hebrew scriptures. So all of these guidelines, I think, are really helpful in what many people find an increasingly isolated situation. And I want to say, well, maybe you need to look again at some of the classic guidelines to help you navigate some of these difficult situations. Your conscience will always be the deciding factor. Your conscience is the supreme authority in your life. And when I say that, people are often a little surprised that I say that as a Catholic monk, but it is the teaching of the Catholic Church that your conscience is your supreme authority.
What do you mean by conscience?
And this is where people misunderstand what certainly what the church means by conscience. If you look at the word itself, you've got a hint of it. Conscience. Science with other people. Science meaning knowledge, scientia in Latin, which means knowledge. But it's been narrowed in modern culture to mean the natural sciences. But in another world, it means knowledge of all kinds. So knowledge with other people. It's your skill as a human being to know right and wrong. Now, every human being has this skill. That's one of the most amazing things about being human. And the free exercise of your conscience is one of the greatest gifts that every human has. In contemporary culture, it's been identified with how I feel. And that's the fatal mistake.
What's the difference? Because if you're relying on your conscience, then I can imagine that can be greatly impacted by how you feel.
Of course. But let me give you an illustration. I was once approached by a woman who was a married woman who was having an affair. And I listened and I said, so now I think you're reaching a decision point. You know, she was thinking, should I leave my husband? And I said, well, you're reaching a decision point in which you'll probably have to choose between what your conscience says and how you feel. And she replied very quickly, oh, well, my conscience says stay with my husband and my feeling says leave. And I think that kind of illustrates really a sense that there is a distinction to be made. And while feeling has an influence over your conscience, there are other factors to be taken into account, other people. And also, I say you haven't made a decision in conscience if you haven't consulted other people. Because that's the difference about feelings. If you just say, the great thing that always worries me is when people say, it felt right at the time. I think, yeah, that's usually a very bad sign. If it just felt right at the time, you've probably done something really quite seriously not good. So if you can actually have a sense that there is a wider palette from which to choose than just your feelings, and that palette includes classical guidelines about how to conduct relationships. It includes the opinions of other people whom you respect, not just necessarily your mates, but people who are maybe more detached from your situation, who know you a little, like, typically at school it would be a teacher. Maybe go and talk to a teacher about it rather than just saying, well, it felt right at the time. So there are ways to expand your conscience. And the teaching of the Catholic Church on this is that an informed conscience is always right. An informed conscience, namely, you've taken the trouble to find out what are the classic teachings about this situation. You've taken the trouble to consult another wise person, and then you've made a choice. Now, your choice may be condemned by other people. Typically, you may be, for example, a Christian in a country which has an oppressive regime. You've got to be very careful how you conduct yourself. And you've arrived at a moment where you've got to decide, am I going to speak out or not? Now, it felt right at the time would be a bad way to make a decision to publish an article criticizing the government. If you're going to do that, think carefully. What is the classic teaching about the rights of an individual and a government? What might wiser heads than yours say about it? Mm. And if you then make the informed decision in conscience, you may well then be persecuted, get it in the neck, and so on. But you will have made a good, informed, conscientious decision, which you'll be able to stick by because you made it in conscience, not just how I felt at the time.
Mm. Let's unpack this a little bit more. This difference between feelings and conscience.
Yeah.
If we had a human being that we fed and watered like a plant, we kept them alive in a lab, but we never gave them human contact. Yeah. The most they saw was the robot's arm giving them the trays of food and the windows opening to give them the sunlight that they need to be happy. Do they not have a conscience until they've ever interacted with other people?
Well, I'd like to take a step back from the example. I mean, it's a person brought up like that would be less than fully human. That's the first point to say.
Why?
Because the relationships are a key part of our humanity. That's the insight I'm trying to get across. And the relationships are one of the features that make us human. And if we start to deny that relationships are part of humanity, then we're in, I think, very difficult territory, because without the relationships, we cannot flourish as human beings. And this is the challenge for modernity, is that true human freedom is dependent upon relationships.
I completely agree, but let's separate humanity from being human.
Ooh, I'm not sure I can do that.
Surely
let's have a go.
There must be a more scientific definition of a human that means, regardless of what makes you flourish, you are a human.
Okay. That's a very analytic understanding of humanity, wanting to analyze it down into bits. And where I come from, there is only a synthetic view of humanity, namely humanity is the sum total of parts. And I find it very difficult to sort of analyze down. Now, we could at this point talk a little bit about left brain, right brain.
Go for it. Love to.
So, this is a theory put forward by a man called Ian McGilchrist, who you may have come across, is a guy who's been a professor of psychiatry, and also before that, a teacher of English literature at Oxford University. So he has a wide understanding of culture, science, and medicine. And his expertise is in how the brain works. Now, he says that the brain has laterality. Now, this is well known, that the left brain controls the right-hand side of our body, and vice versa. But he says, we also know that the left brain is highly analytic and the right brain is synthetic. That's to say, the left brain sees all the detail, the right brain is seeing the bigger picture and putting the details together. Now, it's his opinion that since the 18th century Enlightenment, the left brain's functions have been privileged in our culture, namely analysis, the kind of thing you were just doing, Elliot, to say, well, let's analyze this down and imagine a human being who's in a box and just been fed by a machine, sort of trying to analyze the thing down to bits. And he says that has a really important function and has brought great benefits to society. The problem is, if you privilege the left brain, you are not working in the way that the brain itself works. Because he says that actually the dominant part of the brain is the right-hand part of the brain. And the right brain, which has this synthetic overall, what we might call intuitive picture of reality, what you might call a fuzzy picture of reality, that is actually the way we work day to day. We see general pictures and then we analyze. And he says, if your whole education system is focused on just fine-tuning the left brain and saying everything the right brain sees is, quotes, just a matter of opinion, he says you will make people mentally ill. And he believes that is what's happening in our culture. Now, the rather amazing experiment I've seen in his books consists of the following. We can now stimulate the brain with probes and suppress bits of the brain in a way that we couldn't before. We used to rely on people who had had a stroke and closed down one part of the brain to analyze this. Now we can do it scientifically, and we can put electrodes on people's head and modify the way the brain is working. So you get a person to sit down and draw a picture of a tree. And there you are, they'll draw a picture of a tree. You then close down the right brain, and the left brain is now solely dominant, and it will draw you an extremely detailed picture of half the tree. And you then close down the left brain and you have the right brain dominant. you will get somebody who draws a very bad picture of the whole tree because it's not seeing the detail. Now, he says this is what's happening in our culture, is that people are seeing all the truth about half of reality. And he says, we're not seeing the whole of reality, that the whole of reality, he insists, our knowledge of what is real includes the spiritual and the truths of morality, and that these things are not a matter of opinion. They are real realms of life, the metaphysical, the transcendent, whatever you want to call it. That is a real part of life. And if you like, the growth of interest in spirituality shows that. There's a real dimension of life. It's not just a bunch of neurochemical features in the brain. This is a reality that exists beyond us, and which our brains are well tuned to tune into if we allow that right brain to have a bigger say in how we approach reality. And he's devoted his life to trying to explain this with experiments. And I think it's almost life-changing stuff once you start to understand what he's saying. And he then says, we can dispute what it is the right brain is seeing. There are different religions, there are different moral codes, but that we are talking about a reality is what he's saying. This is not simply, quotes, a matter of opinion. These are realities of life which we can explore together. And as we explore them together, our lives will be richer.
I guess the way I'd push back on that is saying that this example is someone conceptualizing a tree. So even though if they draw half the tree, they're missing out on the other half of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were lacking the truth of the full tree, but they were lacking the ability to conceptualize the full tree. And I've spoken to Glenn Scrivener about this, who's a Christian pastor, and we had a similar discussion about the idea of how important stories are to humans, and that the Bible hinges upon stories because they're important and they're a way of seeing the truth. But the pushback I give is that just because they're more effective at bringing home a message, I don't necessarily think that that makes it any more true. It just makes it easier for us to break down and understand.
So help me understand the distinction you're making. Are you saying that there is language over here, spoken language, and also the language of drawing, if you like, over on one side, and then there's the reality on the other side? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I just don't think that drawing example proves that human was missing out on the truth that there is a tree. Rather, without that right brain, they were just unable to conceptualize the whole tree. But there's surely an actual reality beyond just our senses that we have to ground based in analytical form, such as defining what a human is. Without that, there must be problems that we run into because we can't define anything for sure.
Well, I think that's what Ian McGilchrist is challenging. He's saying, no, we can know what's real, but we will have to have a more expansive view of reality if we're to cope with everything that there is to be experienced and known. And that certainly was my personal experience as a student, was I found people who gave me what I call ruthlessly scientific explanations of life, I just found deeply unconvincing. I thought, that's not how I experience life. I don't experience myself as a naked ape. I don't experience myself as, totally driven by animal desires. I experience life just kind of more broadly. It's also a great deal more enjoyable than just being a naked ape. So I suppose I've just always had this deep conviction that there is more to know. And what McGilchrist seems to be doing is giving me permission to know it. That I am allowed to know that. I am allowed to know that there is such a thing as truth, beauty, goodness, that these are real, and that my life is richer for trying to know them and celebrate them, as opposed to saying, well, they're just a matter of opinion. The fact that we can disagree about what is beautiful does not stop there being a reality called beauty. I think that's the point.
And this is what I'm trying to dig into, because I think the key word there is what you experience. But what I want to know is how we know what's true. How do we avoid running into this ever arbitrary situation of what makes someone human? For example, if we take what you said about conscience, where's the line? What is it that makes someone a human with a conscience, and what makes them, what you said, subhuman?
Less than fully human.
Less than fully human, sorry.
It's different.
Yes.
So I think that's where I come back to community. In the end, there is nowhere else to go than a community deciding what is real. Now, you may say that sounds a bit, a little bit flaky, but actually, of course, it's what science is based on. Science is a community of people who've done experiments who agree on an outcome. And then somebody comes along who's a heretic and challenges that, and then science advances. But the heretic becomes the new hero when the community is convinced that the heretical idea is actually true. Now, Galileo is the classic example of that. He was literally a heretic until all of a sudden everybody realized, including the church, that he was right. So it is still about a community deciding what is real. And my concern, as McGilchrist expresses it, is that our current Western culture community has far too narrow an understanding of what is real. And that what people like him are trying to do is to persuade the community to expand its understanding of what is real. And I think yours is the first generation in 50 years that might be open to that, because you don't have the previous scars, if you like, of an older generation who had to fight themselves free of those institutions to express their individuality. But now I think there's a move back to individuals saying, I understand the critical importance of community in my life, including allowing the community to point me to what is real. Not browbeating me, that's the accompaniment piece. Accompanying me on the journey as I discover what is real. And that's, I think, the shift for the institutions. Don't browbeat, accompany.
Forgive my secular assumptions.
Yeah.
But
that's good. I've got religious assumptions. You got secular assumptions. That's why there's a good dialogue.
It just seems to me that there must be a way of digging down to ground truth, and you might need to use your right brain and community and agree on it to get to that point as a technique by the nature of how we work as humans. But then once you've got that, it just feels like there must be, separate to community, separate to mutual agreement with anyone, a way of quantitatively proving that things are true. Otherwise, surely the very fabric of our society collapses if we can't prove that anything is true quantitatively.
Oh, it's the quantitatively thing that I think I might challenge. I think truth is obviously served by quantitative analysis. But in the end, I think it's actually a quality that we recognize the quality of what's being said.
Flesh that out for me a little bit more, the distinction.
So again, taking the science, if the person who is bringing you the new scientific information can enhance the quality of our knowledge, namely it's more secure, they don't just bring you a whole stack of figures, but that they also start to show you how those figures change the way we understand reality, then the quality of your knowing is starting to be changed, not just the quantity of it. We're in slightly difficult territory making that distinction, but I think we know the quality of what's being said. So I'm not a scientist, but I do know a bit about language. And often the analysis of language, I just go, now that's a very, very smart piece of analysis. And I think there's high quality in that linguistic analysis. And then other people, typically who produce spurious origins of words, they take some word and they produce a history of its origin, and you think that's absolute rubbish. So there is a quality that we know that when somebody's talking to you, and I think as regards the spiritual moral life, it's the quality of the person's life that speaks to us. Does that person have integrity? So I see what you're striving. You're striving for the idea that there is an objective reality out there, which surely must be within my measurable grasp. I must be able to grasp it. Is that roughly right?
Yes, I think that's stretching it a little bit because that feels quite big and it feels like an assumption that we can measure everything. I'm sure there are certain things that are just beyond our remit as humans of understanding. But what I'm trying to get to is even just proving the smaller things that we can prove, because at the moment it feels like I'm saying you can with science experiments, and there are fundamental things like the earth is round.
Yeah, and that this is a table and so on. I mean, there was a stage when, Oxford philosophers used to challenge the statement, this is a table, how do you know it's a table, and so on. I think we're beyond that. But I think what we now see is that there are categories of knowledge. So there are categories of empirical knowledge. But the shift now is saying empirical knowledge is no longer the only kind of knowledge. And I think what you're grasping for is, can we find an empirical basis for claims about conscience? And I suppose what I'm saying is the empirical knowledge is the human experience itself. The fact that if you look at people, you look at people throughout history and today in a particular way, you say they all have the skill of conscience. Now, somebody can then turn around and say, well, they've just had that from, having it drilled into them as children, what's right and wrong and so on. But I think that's a very facile view of this, because it's clear that precisely because people have different moral codes in history, it proves that there is something called an urge to have a moral code. It's in our DNA to have a moral code. We can argue about what it contains, but that it's a real part of human life seems to me indisputable, unless you're going to ask for kind of empirical, in the narrow sense, evidence for the existence of something like conscience. And I don't think that would be appropriate. And I think that's what I'm saying is, let's keep an expansive view of reality, because actually, in my experience, it delivers more connection with what I experience human life to be. And I experience human life as this expansive reality with many dimensions, including a strong metaphysical, ethical, transcendent dimension. That's part of life's rich experience. And if we narrow it down, we're leading a narrow existence, which focuses too much on the individual and not enough on the collective experience of the richness of human life.
I can completely see what you're saying. And I guess the problem that I take with it is that different cultures are going to have different consciences collectively, and they're going to agree on things that feel right and wrong. And for all intensive purposes, they may live their entire life doing what was right and wrong within their conscience and what they've been exposed to. And that maybe makes it kind of true in an almost arbitrary objectivist way, where it's true for all intensive purposes. But what I'm trying to bridge is that gap between true for all intensive purposes and fundamentally true, regardless of culture, variations, time periods, technology, feelings, and emotions.
Well, I think, if you like, the empirical differences are what the rules are. The moral rules may vary, although there is people have attempted, I think successfully, to articulate certain fundamental moral rules that apply everywhere, like, you will not kill another member of the community without the prior permission of the community. Now, that's a pretty universal rule. You won't find many cultures that have survived without that fundamental rule. So, but then if you look beyond that, I think if you leave aside the details, the fact that everybody has these moral senses is what I'm driving at. That seems to me an empirical fact. So the reality of morality seems to me a very powerful example of how the metaphysical world, the world beyond, is empirically true. In other words, absolute morality, the sense that I as an individual experience an absolute call not to kill that child. I experience that as real as anything. I must not kill that child. Now, that to me starts to show this is a real part of human life. It's not something you or I invented. It is part of the reality of being human. And I think that the human rights world, the world of human rights that's evolved since the Second World War, is a really interesting example of how people are starting to say there can be universal agreement about it. Now, again, some British politicians disagree with the European Declaration on Human Rights for all sorts of political reasons. And they say we must have a British, Declaration of Rights. Fine, but we're still arguing about the reality of what those rights are. But that they exist is something that's increasingly recognized.
Well, I don't want to get into apologetics too much because I know that there's so much more value that we can be talking about. But I think this is important and it's helpful.
I'm going to take a drink of water.
Go for it. Enjoy your smart water.
Yes.
Emotions are true. And what you feel is based on hormones with my outlook of the world. So it's true that you're experiencing those emotions and it's true that you're feeling those hormones, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the conclusion you come to is true. So from my outlook on the world, these ideas of the fact that we have this metaphysical experience with the world and that we all feel this urge not to kill another baby, that doesn't get proved by the fact that we have the urge not to kill the baby itself, but just a different route explaining that we wouldn't want our baby to be killed. Therefore, we have this naturally evolving urge. We knew that if we killed someone else's baby 1,000 years ago, the whole tribe would come back and kill our tribe. That seems much more believable to me. How would you say otherwise?
Well, at a certain point, you've got to make a choice. Which of these sets of explanations of reality persuades you more than another? Of course, it's about a choice. And that's where, as I said, the notion that an institution like the church can browbeat you into what you believe is now long gone. But I just... So, I mean, there was a famous... the famous author of The Naked Ape was a book written back in the 70s, I think, by a man called Desmond Morris. And I read it and I just thought, well, I just don't experience life like this. So I just keep coming back to my own experience and saying, I really don't experience life as if I'm a naked ape. I just don't buy that. So it comes back to how broad is your experience shelf in your life? So I just like the thought of I've got a really big shelf here, which has a massively joyful experience of so many dimensions of life, as opposed to something to say to me, well, those are all just matters of opinion. What you really need to focus on as the truth is this little bit over here, and then you'll be secure. And I go, no, I won't be secure because I'll be focusing on far too narrow a part of life. And actually, the really enjoyable part of life is often found in the other parts of my experience shelf. So, if somebody says that, falling in love with a girlfriend is explained by the neurochemical developments in my brain, I'm going to say, you've obviously never been in love.
If all of the things that you believe in were disproven to be objectively true, there is a way of measuring truth in this quantitative, scientific way. Whatever you're doing and going about is amazing, but it's not objectively true. Would you keep implementing the things that you've been implementing your whole life, do you think?
Well, the short answer to that question is yes. The longer answer is I'd want to challenge what you mean by that word objective. It's a very slippery word, objective, subjective, deeply slippery stuff. And ever since Immanuel Kant, I think it's been debunked because Kant noticed that the observer changes the observed reality. The observer changes the observed reality, and scientists know that. They have to be very careful that their measuring instruments don't alter the experiment, and so on. So we know. So I'd want to say to you, you've got to be very careful. The notion that you can have an objective reality. The best we have is our interactions. And that's not the same as objective reality. It's our interactions with reality that tell me what's going on. And part of those interactions can be scientific experiments. But the other interactions, like loving my family, are not explained in that way.
Benedict talks about keeping death daily before our eyes. And this is something I wanted to speak to you about, because the relationship that Gen Z have with death is fascinating to me. I never really hear friends speaking about death, and I know that I tend to stray away from it. I went to my first funeral a couple of years ago, a family member, but that's the only funeral I've been to. Mortality rates are much lower nowadays, which is great, and you're going to go to less funerals. How important is it to keep death before our eyes daily?
I think it's really important. And one of the experiences I've had is presiding over the funeral of somebody your age, for example. And you find a church full of completely bemused young people. This is not part of the script. This should not be happening. And as you say, death is now so rare compared to a previous era that it's something they can't quite calculate. Their brains are kind of frozen. And that's the reality we're living with now. And I think it shows that actually young people ought to have a greater sense of death because, the reality is somebody in your generation will die before their time. That's the reality you've got to face. And if you're not prepared for it, it's even harder. So what does it mean to have death daily before your eyes? Well, I use the example of back planning. Now, if you're an engineer, you're familiar with back planning. An engineer who's told to build a bridge over this river doesn't start by saying, I think I'll put a concrete pier here and I'll put some cables over there. No, they start with the completed bridge. And then they say, what's the penultimate state before the bridge is complete? And then the step before that and then they get back to the right place to put the piers and the cables. So the same can happen in human life. An exercise which I've given to some people of your age, and their minds are completely blown when I give it to them. I said, I want you to picture yourself on your deathbed. Now, hopefully, you'll be well into old age. So let's imagine life's gone well. You've not had some terrible disease too young. You're, in your 80s, maybe your 90s, lying on your bed, knowing you're dying because you've now got, you're too old for any medical treatment to be effective for what you're lying there. What do you hope you'd done the day before you got that diagnosis? What do you hope you'd done the week before, the month before, the year before, the decade before? Because that may then help you to understand how to live the decade before. And at the same time, it gives you a sense of perspective that even if you're doing the best thing you can the decade before, the thing you really want to do, actually it is going to come to an end. And my experience of people who've led very full lives is that as their life starts to come to an end, the fullness of their lives is a rich consolation to them. And they retain, what strikes me is they retain a great interest in other people. So they're not sinking into a kind of guilty obsession about their own health or well-being or whatever, that there is an expansiveness about their appreciation of life. And I think that's because they had that expansive, joyful approach during life. So I think on our deathbed, we become more like we always were, but stripped down to the essentials. And therefore, you want to say to yourself, what do I want my essentials to be when I'm dying? And if you can focus on that, you'll get a good guidance as to how to live life now. But also, it takes the sting out of death, because you've now lived the way you wanted to live, not the way that you were just forced into living in some way. And now that's a privilege, because many people can't choose the way they live. Poverty, famine, and so on drive them out. But even within that context, they can still have a sense of their best self that they want to bring every day. And I do think that, so there are two reasons for keeping death daily before our eyes. One, because it could happen to somebody near you or to you yourself. Recently, one of the monks in one of our monasteries died at the age of 63 of a heart attack during Vespers, during evening prayer. So there he was, singing the praises of God, age 63, and he dropped dead of a heart attack. Now, in monastic circles, everybody said, well, we're going to really miss the guy. But God, what a great way for a monk to go, you know. So he was in a sense, ready for death because he was there focused on outside himself, on God with his community, focused on his community and God. And that is, in a sense, what I'd like to think on my deathbed. I'd focused on my community and God and other people. And that then helps me, I think, to live life better. But also it means that if I am focusing on that, then I can die happy any time.
Are you familiar with the phrase YOLO?
No.
You only live once.
Oh, you only live once. Okay.
There's this...
That can have a slightly different meaning, of course, which is that eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, which is the great Epicurus saying.
Right. Very different.
Which is very different, yeah.
Where do we go wrong as a generation? Because there's such a prominence of this YOLO mentality that gets put out.
Yes.
And in many ways, that seems related to keeping death daily before our eyes, because we're reminding ourselves that we only live once.
Yes.
But people don't seem to be more fulfilled and live a life that they would be happy with on their deathbed, even though they are reminding themselves of the fact that they are going to die one day. In that situation, it rather seems like YOLO often spirals to the pursuit of hedonism and short term.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the famous question. I think of various saints, and I think Martin Luther also was asked this question, you know, what would you do if you knew the world was going to end tomorrow? And the best answer I ever heard is, I'd go out and plant a tree. I think that's a wonderful answer. And it's the sense that, you know, you just carry on doing what you're doing. If you're leading life, see, the YOLO thing presumes that you're not leading life the way you want to lead it, doesn't it? It presumes that you've got to do something extraordinary and special. You've got to, you know, fulfill a bucket list of things to do and whatever, as opposed to saying that the way I'm leading life now is just fine because I've chosen to lead my life this way, and it's okay. And I'll do the things that I'm doing now because what I'm doing now is what I've chosen to do well. If that makes sense.
How do we get that balance? How do we keep death before our eyes daily in a better way than that YOLO? And how do we make sure that we don't micromanage everything and change it when it doesn't need to get changed?
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the key ways is prayer. Daily prayer. And I think this connects to how we view the future. So if we have a sense that the future ultimately is hopeful, then it seems to me if we have some sense of daily spiritual practice of prayer or meditation of some kind, which is not just focused on my physical well-being, which is a kind of narrow interpretation of yoga. I mean, if you talk to Indians about yoga, they'll tell you it's a way of life, not a series of gym exercises. And if we have a wider sense of spirituality, and that the future is hopeful, no matter how bad things may seem in the short term, there is a hopeful future, then that daily practice is a way of experiencing our death daily in a positive light. Now, that sounds a little strange. I think what I'm saying is that if I bring my life, if I just have a stop moment when I'm just focusing on that dimension of life, which hopefully is eternal, if I just focus on that, what classic religion calls my soul, just focus on that, then I'm reminding myself daily that part of me is going to die, but another part of me will have an eternal life. And so that exercise for me is really important. Even something as simple as saying a simple Christian prayer. There are some rather wonderful prayers about that, famously Thomas More. Thomas More, that name ring a bell?
It rings a bell, but no more than that.
His picture's over there. He was born in this part of London, and he was the Chancellor of England. He was Lord Mayor of London and then Chancellor of England under Henry VIII. And he disagreed with Henry VIII, and Henry VIII had him executed. And so he was, this was quite a shock in English politics to have the Chancellor of England executed by the King. But he never lost his sense of humour, and he never lost his sense of hope. And he, I can't get the exact wording of the whole prayer right, but it concludes, it's a prayer he's saying, thinking of his family, his wife and children. And he says, maybe one day, and so one day we will meet merrily in heaven. It's a great phrase, to meet merrily in heaven. And so it has this great sense of humour and optimism that actually, and this for me is really important as a Christian, that death is not the last word. And I think that's a key dimension of this, is we do at some point have to make a decision whether we think death is the last word in life or not. And that affects deeply, it seems to me, the way we live.
Well, I think in a secular fashion, you can do the same thing as what you're doing with believing that death isn't the last word, in that your legacy lives on through your family and the impact that you make on the world. And that's certainly what I've experienced with my fear of death, because preparing for this, it was something that I thought about, and I hadn't really thought about it before, but I am terrified of death and being on my deathbed, regretting what I did. I used to say when I was about 13 that my biggest fear was being average and living an average life. And maybe you'll have issues with that, but that fear of death has certainly always fueled me. And I don't quite know where it comes from, because I haven't been exposed to much death at all in my childhood. I haven't watched many movies where they deal with death. It's just been sprung upon me, perhaps by divine force, who knows?
Well, it's fear of the unknown. If you've not seen people die and experienced death around you, then it's yet one more unknown thing to fear. In those cultures where death is more common, where, for example, where the tradition is to lay out the body of the deceased in the house where they lived, and for people to come round and sit round and have a drink around his body in a wake, all of a sudden, it's not so unknown. And then there's the unknown of what happens after death, of course. But death itself is one of the great unknowns in our culture. Much as Irish culture still celebrates death. And I've met that culture clash in a family that has English and Irish sides to it. And the two differences are really remarkable. And in fact, when I was a religious studies teacher, I would sometimes ask a class, because we had to study a unit on death rituals, I'd say, so tell me about the death rituals in your family. And students with a purely English heritage said, well, not much. And then you'd get Irish, you'd get African, you'd get Caribbean, and all these different cultures all had different ways of doing it, including, some cultures where the body is carried around the village to celebrate this person. And the English are sitting there open-mouthed and thinking, this sounds awful. So English culture is particularly weak on having a set of rituals and events that help us to cope with death. So the ritual, it's one of the things that I think people lack nowadays is rituals to help cope with life's vital moments. Some of these modern weddings I find hilarious, what people want to do as a ritual at a wedding, because the point of a ritual is you don't make it up yourself to some extent. You're inheriting a previous era's insights about how to do this. And I think rituals are so helpful at crucial moments. And I think what's really interesting is people who don't necessarily share a belief of a religious community still find the rituals of that religious community really helpful at crucial moments. I think that's very true of funerals and death.
I wonder what would happen or will happen when I'm exposed to more death throughout my life, because at the moment it feels contrary to what I was saying earlier with being familiar with death. Actually, like you said, that fear of the unknown drives me.
Yeah.
So I do wonder what will happen once I do become more familiar, at least with dying, not what comes after. That's always going to be a big fear. But, I almost hesitate to expose myself to death too much.
Yes. I think that's very common nowadays. And it's really quite tricky to go against that. So trying to persuade people to visit the body of a person who's just died, which is a great Catholic tradition, is really quite hard to do. And it's really striking in other countries. So I've had a small experience of working in a shantytown in Peru, and their death was very common. These were very poor people, and children would die. And the thought of the body of the child just disappearing was unthinkable. The body of the child was kept in an open coffin in the house to celebrate the life of the person and to face the fact they die and to accompany them on their journey to heaven. So this vivid sense, and the other children would see the dead child. Now, English people find this very morbid. I found it deeply moving. This wasn't imposed on people. This was their natural response. Massive grief, but at the same time, total realism about what had just happened and that this is a dimension of life, especially if you're poor. So I think we have, impoverished ourselves by keeping death as a clinical thing over there, as opposed to a normal part of life. And it's really quite hard to overcome that, especially since people think you're morbid if you behave like that. So I've learned to attune myself to the culture I'm in. In England, it's very hard to press it, but if I'm in Peru, then that's normal.
You mentioned earlier briefly about the importance of having faith and optimism about the future. Yeah. And that's something I'd love to talk to you about. Jordan Peterson speaks about this very well. And this speech that he gave was what inspired me to move out at such a young age and take on the adventure of life. He frames it in the way of faith being courageous.
Yes.
And I think that's a much more useful tool to use rather than faith being based on delusion. He said this: faith is the kind of courage that allows you to welcome the possibilities of the future with open arms. And I say possibility because the future is the manifestation of possibility into actuality. And the possibility of the future is what we contend with. Yeah. The unknown treasure house of what could be is what we contend with, and given that's what we eternally contend with, we may ask ourselves how best to contend with that. And one answer is with the faith that is simultaneously courageous.
That's an awful lot of words to say something quite simple, I think.
Well, it sounds like you've summarized Jordan Peterson quite nicely and concisely, more importantly.
Yeah, I mean, yes, obviously. I mean, it's just that, the great trio is faith, hope, and charity. So I want to sort of focus on the interconnection of the three. And he's kind of saying that. But it seems to me that, there's a little bit of a divide at the moment with, on the one hand, people saying, oh, well, life's all about love. It's all about love. The charity bit. It's what life's about is love. And then you get sort of slightly more, perhaps fundamentalist religious people saying, no, it's all about faith. It's all about faith in God. And I would say, look, guys, actually, the one that really matters is hope, which underpins the other two. If you haven't got hope, you will not be very good at loving, and you won't be very faithful. So hope is, and that's the missing quantity in contemporary culture. And I do think that hope is what enables faith and love to be activated. It's what you might call the active ingredient. Because without hope, we're not going to persevere through the difficulties that love presents, and we're not going to persevere through the difficulties that faith presents, because faith is at times very hard to persevere with, as is love. So it's all to do with perseverance, which of course is not a popular contemporary quality. And it seems to me hope gives you the reason to persevere through the difficulties of whatever kind. And that hope is a quality that contemporary culture doesn't speak about much, just like it doesn't speak much about death. And there's a connection, because death appears to remove hope. And that's where I would say, no, I have hope in the face of death for a whole variety of reasons. But the hopelessness that some people in wealthy countries feel nowadays is deeply concerning. So if you're living in the Sudan at the moment and you're facing this forgotten war, basically, where the West has kind of forgotten about you, but it's this hideous war going on in Sudan, if you're feeling hopeless, I can understand it. What's less understandable is to be somebody living in, a moderately wealthy Western country who's not dying on the street from famine, who's just having a hard time and feels it's so hopeless. And I want to say, we have to be providing reasons for living and hoping to people nowadays, because that's the only thing that will get them through their difficulties.
What's so odd to me is that lack of hope for someone that's grown up in a middle-class background, they have the stack of proof behind them that you should be hopeful.
Yeah.
Because they're living a pretty comfortable life.
Yeah.
So it's weird that we always seem to, that there's some merit in this, not taking the past as a prover of what's to come.
Yeah.
But you do have that evidence there to suggest that you should be hopeful.
Yeah.
And it's something I've been thinking about a lot, this rise of cynicism. You get all these black pill communities online, they call them. Taking the black pill means just buying into this idea of nihilism and that there's no point to life.
Right.
Everything's predetermined. You shouldn't try. You should just curl up in bed and rot away. And it's odd.
But there are actual communities saying that?
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, it's a kind of ultimate expression of a particular approach, secular approach to life, isn't it, I suppose?
But the thing with all of this cynicism is that it's not grounded in the very reality that they're experiencing. And people try and put their finger on why this cynicism is growing. And one of the explanations is that it's a shortcut to being right all the time. Because if you're cynical of something, if it still happens to go your way by some miracle, yippity-doo, it went great. But if it doesn't, I told you I was right. I told you that women suck and that they're never going to date me and that they're always going to cheat on me, or whatever the example is.
Yeah.
But to flip this whole conversation on its head, I think another explanation away from fear of death can be fear of living.
Yeah.
And it ties into this idea of not wanting to be wrong. There's this book called The Four Agreements, and the author says, that is why humans resist life. To be alive is the biggest fear humans have. Death is not the biggest fear we have. Our biggest fear is taking the risk to be alive. The risk to be alive and express what we really are. Just being ourselves is the biggest fear of humans.
And in order to have the courage to live, you have to have reasons for living and hoping. And I suppose that's the piece that concerns me most, is that so many young people don't appear to have anything to go on except their own personal resources, their own inner resources, never mind their own, wage-earning physical resources. And I think that's a place that would be feeling very hopeless, because if the entire answer to life is me, then God, what an inadequate question. If I personally am the answer to life, then life is a very poor question, would be the way I'd put it. There are bigger questions to which I am not the answer. And if I want to live life to the full, I better go and find those questions and then find somebody who might accompany me to answer them. Now, how we do that is tricky, because we circle back to the consumerist culture, which keeps me feeling that if I consume this thing, that thing, or the other thing, then I'll be okay. I'll have found the answer. And that even applies to, spirituality, which can now be packaged and sold to you in a way that's, cheap and easy. So, and then you're really in trouble, because now you've not only got a decent wage, you've even got, your own spiritual answer to your own spiritual question without having to bother with finding anybody else's question or their answer. So this is a very vulnerable place to be, it seems to me.
Well, speaking about this me culture, you write about vicious humility.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
It's saying, well, every time somebody asserts something to be true, somebody will say, well, of course, you're clever and I don't know the answer. So they use their kind of own humility to undermine anything anybody else says. And it's a kind of, I'm not sure it's real humility. I think it's a way of avoiding listening to other people. So real humility is being grounded. Humus means soil. You can buy bags of it at garden centres, humus, not to be confused with hummus being bought from your local supermarket. And it means being grounded in reality. And that being grounded in reality includes not refusing to hear what other people are saying and receiving it, as opposed to just undermining it. So humility does not undermine other people, it affirms them. So when they offer you something, you receive it thoughtfully. You may want to question it, fine, but you don't retreat into this vicious humility of saying, well, what do I know? What do you know? What do any of us know? Which is a kind of vicious humility.
Benedict says that the speaker only admits with the tongue.
I beg your pardon?
Benedict says that the speaker only admits with their tongue when they say these things.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And it sort of feeds into this whole performative, toxic compassion of saying that you care about someone, but really just being risk averse and being performative. You're doing it as a theatrical show of your virtue rather than truly meaning it.
It's humility is the longest chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict, because he knew it was the hardest thing to get right. And experience shows that. And nowadays the problem is people connect humility with humiliation, and the two are different. They're both about coming down to earth, but humility is when I bring myself down to earth, and I'm, as people say, I'm grounded. A grounded person is humble. When you have brought somebody else down, that's humiliation. So I didn't bring myself down. Somebody else brought me down. Now, that humiliation can sometimes be deserved when somebody takes you down a peg or two for being too arrogant. But far too often, it's an imposed humiliation of degrading somebody, degrading another person, degrading a woman, degrading a person who's from a different ethnic group, and so on. And those humiliations are terrible. And they usually do not lead to humility. They usually lead to the other person being outraged at what's happened to them, quite rightly.
Mm. You talk about us being a self-made society that worships our creators.
Yes.
How do you see that unfolding in the next few decades?
Well, I think all bets are off at the moment, politically, socially, because of what's happening in our democratic societies, and indeed what's happening in our less democratic societies. But clearly there are political shifts going on in the world. They're going to be very hard to predict where they end up. But I think looked at, that's on the macro level. On the more day-to-day personal level, I think people are going to be creating more communities, and they're going to be giving more attention to classic communities like churches, like community centres and so on. But they're going to have to do this in new ways. So I think where we're heading is potentially to a very disruptive political future, which will, is the end of the post-World War II consensus, which we've lived with, in Western terms, very fruitfully for, the last 75 years. And at the local level, I think people are going to become more creative in the way they approach their lives communally, not just individually. But the question is, can we create that local culture of community fast enough, seems to me, before there's more damage done to more individuals? And then will the macro political direction of travel undermine that or foster it? So the growing nationalism, you could say, that will foster localism. On the other hand, you might say, no, it could undermine it. So I think all bets are off, and it's a great creative opportunity for many people locally, globally, to create new institutions to address a set of new situations.
It feels like an uphill battle with all the technology that allows you to be so self-sufficient. You don't need to go to a baker to get your bread. You can get it delivered the next day.
Yes.
You don't need to go and see your parents for the family dinner because you can FaceTime them.
Yeah. And I think there's no question the technology is pushing us in the other direction, although it does push us also in the direction of having more connections. I think Facebook friends are not really friends, they're connections. So we can, for example, use the technology to inform a wider group of people about what your community is trying to achieve and encourage them to join the real community as opposed to just the online community. So the technology is a great marketing tool for creating communities, and a lot of local communities use it that way. But it is, on the whole, though, driving people to greater individual independence.
One of the key points in the Benedictine tradition that comes up again and again is this idea of containing your desires. And I think this links nicely to the technology that we have that constantly satiates our desires instantly. And I'd love to pick your brains on this. There's this trend that's emerged on the internet called monk mode. Have you heard of this?
Funnily enough, I just heard of it the other day and I was intrigued, really. So tell me a bit more about it.
So there are different communities on Reddit. They call themselves the monk mode communities. And there are certain rules that are essential. So here we go. Meditation, 10 minutes daily. Exercise, 30 minutes daily. You have to avoid substances, no alcohol or drugs. And you have to limit the social interactions. Avoid meeting people outside of your girlfriend and mother. What is a monk's perspective on monk mode?
Well, actual monks share some of those disciplines of monk mode, but by no means all of them. For example, we kind of invented the modern drinking of alcohol historically. We're some of the greatest brewers and winemakers in history. But more seriously, we would add in connecting to the other members of your community. That's the big difference. Never mind just girlfriend and mother. And of course, we wouldn't have a girlfriend either. So at the level of relationships, I find that quite interesting, that what they're focusing on is a rather sort of personal lifestyle issue about, I'm going to contain my lifestyle and put disciplines around that. Now, the question I'd like to ask them is, why are you doing that? Is there any indication of their motivation?
I question this a lot. And obviously, you could say that part of it's just jumping on a trend that's already existent. It's often pitched by these big tech millionaires that live an Instagrammable life, and they attribute their success to things like monk mode and locking themselves away in their bedroom and working online and reading the stock charts daily. So I think an element of it is chasing success.
Right.
And what's quite funny now that I say that out loud is that that's pretty much antithetical to the lifestyle of a monk, because they're chasing success, which in their paradigm is defined as money and people being jealous of the money that they have.
So monk mode is about getting rich.
I'd be cautious of summarizing it in that way, but from what I've seen, a lot of the time, monk mode is a means to the end, and the end is having more material success.
Okay. Well, the context of real monk mode is quite different. The ultimate goal of the Christian life is to inherit the kingdom of God. But the early monks and nuns who inspired St. Benedict said that seems rather far away. So let's come to a nearer goal, and the nearer goal is purity of heart. Now, this is a very alien expression in contemporary culture, the notion that one of the goals of life is to have a pure heart. And immediately it's associated with sexual purity. But in the monastic tradition, it includes that, but it's much broader. It's about having pure intentions in life. And it's based on the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And that's how the monks connect it to the kingdom of God, saying, well, if you want to see God in the kingdom of God, you've got to have a pure heart, because that's what Jesus says. So then how do you obtain this pure heart? And then the response comes by prayer without ceasing. To pray without ceasing. And that's the immediate aim of the monastic life. And so the immediate aim of everything is to enable constant prayer. So that's why we have, periods of silence, periods of intense silence. So at night time, we have the great silence. And all of it is about this. And this is not just saying prayers. It does involve a certain amount of saying prayers, but it's a meditative attitude to life, which facilitates a pure heart and seeing God.
And it might sound really obvious to you that you should aim to have a pure heart, but I promise you it's not to someone watching this in Gen Z. Can you make the case for me of why someone should aim to have a pure heart? Why shouldn't they just aim to do the best for themselves, get to the best material circumstances, and if they have to do over a few people along the way for their own benefit, that's okay?
Yeah.
What's the case against that?
Well, we haven't spoken much in this interview so far about the teaching of Jesus, but this would be a good moment, I think, to talk about it. So the Hebrew tradition that Jesus inherited as a good Jew of his day was very clear that there were two great commandments, to love God and to love your neighbor. And the introduction of the word love immediately raises the question of purity. Namely, is my love a pure love? And I think contemporaries can understand this. a girl might say, oh, the boys are only after one thing. And that would be a statement of saying they haven't got a pure love for me. So I think we understand impure love and we understand pure love. So the notion that to love other people for themselves is, I think, something that contemporary people can understand. And in his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spells out the people who are blessed by having certain qualities. And there are people who have who are poor in spirit, people who have purity of heart, even people who mourn, which is a really interesting one. And what he's really doing is he's saying those who are not the most gifted in this world's terms are in fact the most blessed. So it's an overturning of contemporary expectations, in fact, worldly expectations at any moment in history. And he's really saying that if you want to be truly blessed, by which I would interpret, if you want to have the ability to love purely, to have a selfless love, then actually what you'll find is this selfless love among people who are in quite bad situations, which is completely counterintuitive. So someone who's mourning is actually in some strange way more able to love purely than someone who's not. Someone who's poor is more able to love purely than someone who's rich. Someone who has, a deeply good intention, a pure heart, is going to be blessed in a way that those who are scheming to do better, to diddle other people and so on. So it's in Jesus' teaching, he extends the teaching of the Hebrew Scriptures by turning upside down the worldly expectations of his day and our day. And I suppose that's his understanding of where we look to find people with a pure heart. And that those of us who are not in those difficult situations will do well to enter into relationship with such people. It's one of the most powerful challenges I've seen is somebody said, I can't remember who it was now, some quite famous person who said, you say you love the poor, name them. That's really good. In other words, do you actually know people who are in that distressed situation? Can you name them? Do you have a relationship with them? And what he's saying is that our purity of heart will grow insofar as we are connected to those who are most in need. And that again is perhaps counterintuitive, but I think we do know that. Endless people will tell you how, the volunteering they do in the homelessness center, the volunteering they do to teach kids who are behind in their reading, all of these volunteering opportunities, they'll say how much it enriches their lives. I've even had people who've said to me that, their involvement being on the board of governors of their local primary school is the best thing they do in their life. And they look forward to it in a way that they don't look forward to going to their work. And there are signs that this teaching of Jesus is not counter to our own knowledge of the way life works. And so this purity of heart as a goal is something which actually people, it seems to me, who do the volunteering, they're understanding that actually that's a great way to be blessed, is to volunteer to work with those most in need. And I think that, therefore, there is an intuitive understanding of it. I think what's missing is a public expression of saying, this is the goal. This is what we should be aiming for. We should not be endlessly stimulating your desires for more and more stuff. We should be stimulating your desire to have a pure heart at the service of God and others.
Going back to this resistance of desires that seems to be what both real monk mode and online monk mode strive for, I think a commonality is this idea of go sit in your cell and your cell will teach you everything.
Yes.
How do we manage that fine line between self-awareness and introspection And could you maybe outline which one we should be going for?
Well, I'm just thinking about what is the difference between self-awareness and introspection. I mean, I think they're kind of the same thing. It's a question of having a healthy approach to both of them. Namely, there are moments when we should be introspective. You know, if something's just gone badly wrong, we should sit down and think about, well, how did that happen? And that self-awareness, I suppose, is more continuous, isn't it? So we have moments of introspection, and then we hope we lead a life where we're self-aware. And so the introspection can feed into a better self-awareness going on. But we need to grow in self-awareness. It's not something that happens instantly. And hopefully the older we get, the more self-aware we become. But it is crucially important if we're to be better at loving. It's a crucially important factor in the monastic life. So the early years of training in the monastic life are very much about increasing self-awareness. And I think the monk mode people are clearly into that as well.
But the key distinction I'd make is that I think introspection is downstream from self-awareness, but I don't think it works the other way around. And what these things can do is focus too much on introspection, but you lose your self-awareness.
Yes.
And sometimes things like monk mode online can become a cope for not wanting to go out and face your biggest fear that is engaging with people.
Yeah.
It's an excuse to stay away from these dangers. And the connotations of being an introspective person are very good ones. They're very virtuous ones. But there's a key distinction to be had between being introspective and being aware of the bigger picture.
Yeah, but I would still want to support their notion of, meditating. I thought 10 minutes was fascinating. 10 minutes of meditation and 30 minutes of physical exercise. I'd like to turn it around the other way.
Okay.
We do 30 minutes of meditation in the morning and then 30 minutes of reading as well. I'd put in an appeal for reading as a great spiritual discipline, reading of the right kind. And it's to do with having space to just be still. And my experience, having run lots of retreats and having run one of them, or two of them actually, in the full glare of television cameras, is that taking people from very secular backgrounds and encouraging them to be still for 30 minutes is, some of them go slightly stir crazy. And it takes weeks for them to get into it. But once they've got into it, actually they see the benefit of it.
Yeah.
And so I would say that I think they're right to include that. The physical activity, yes, that's obviously really important as well. But I was intrigued that the meditation gets 10 and the physical gets 30. I think if you're going to be serious about growing in that meditative awareness of God and yourself and others, you start with 10 minutes and then it grows to 20 and then it grows to 30. And of course, you will find it difficult. There's a famous story of a great Catholic saint, Teresa of Avila, great 16th century nun, an absolute ball of activity, a great reformer whose life was actually in danger because she was such a reformer. And she would do this 30 minutes of meditation every morning, and she'd have an hourglass with the sand trickling through it. And sometimes she'd get bored after about 20 minutes and she'd shake. She said, I shook the hourglass to make the sand go quicker. So even for saints, it's not always easy. But there is a discipline to that that's really important. And sit in your cell and the cell will teach you everything. Then there's a Buddhist version of it too. The silence will teach you everything.
Or Blaise Pascal, all of man's troubles spring from his inability to sit in his room in silence.
Yes.
Much more practical example that you talk about in your book, you use eating as a great example of this. You say, for example, if I'm hungry, I eat. But if I learn to wait before eating in the discipline called fasting, then the link between desire and action is slowed. This traditional religious discipline has much to commend it, but here I offer it as an example of how we can learn to become more reflective in our response to desire. I find that fascinating, and I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit for me.
Well, I mean, I think it says it all. It's not rocket science. It's pretty simple, really. It's saying just become more self-aware when you want something, and that, there are times when you go, yes, I now need to eat something because otherwise I'm going to start flagging. But then there are other times when you eat compulsively. And even when you feel you need to eat something because you're flagging, there can still be a moment to say, actually, I'm going to break the link there and exercise some self-discipline in the Christian tradition as an act of sacrifice, an act of focusing on that purity of heart so that my body is participating in my spiritual intention. So if you take Lent, the Christian tradition of Lent is that you do three things. You fast, you pray, and you show charity, love to others. You're meant to do all of those anyway, but you do them more in Lent. And the fact that all three are commended is really significant. Namely, if I fast but don't pray, if I fast but don't show love to other people, then there's no point in fasting. It's just, at that point, a diet. And there's a difference between a diet and fasting. The diet is because I want to look good or because, medically speaking, I need to do it to improve my health. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But fasting is always connected to greater generosity in prayer and towards other people. So it's trying to link up the whole of me. It's a very holistic view of the spiritual life and seeing the connections between the different parts.
You go on to say, gluttony and greed, lust and vanity, avarice and anger, these and the other desires of the heart are permanent features of life, but they can be contained so that we react more slowly to them and allow other factors a role in our choices.
Yeah, my key one there that I get a lot of pushback about is anger. So this is really interesting because there's an expression, it's good to let off steam. That's one. And I always say, no, it's only good to let off steam if you're a steam engine. It's not good to let off steam if you're a human. And then other people say, it's good that the other person knows where you stand and letting it out is good. And I say, I just completely disagree with all of that. Anger damages us as well as the other person. And therefore, as soon as you feel the anger rising, a bit like the desire for food, if you can spot it and stop it, now, it will then have to go somewhere, fine. But I find the best thing to do is not to deliver it to the person in front of me, but to contain it and to express it to somebody else, to say, he got me really angry because. Now, occasionally, there is something known in the tradition, in the Christian tradition, as righteous anger, which I prefer to call zeal for justice. So it's when you see an injustice and you want to shout against it. And that, it seems to me, is zeal for justice is a very, very good thing to do. But the key difference is this. Most times that I feel anger rising in me, it's because my personal life has been in some way insulted or challenged. Whereas zeal for justice is when I see an injustice that's happening to another person and I'm wanting to fight on their behalf. Now, it's an act of generosity. Now, that then leaves the position where I'm the one receiving the injustice. Well, again, I actually find that expressing a point of view strongly without getting angry is a good way to deal with any injustice coming towards you. And if you start shouting and screaming at the other person who's responsible for the injustice, it is unlikely that it's going to change their mind. It's much more likely that if you retain a certain presence of mind and speak to them about it, you might have a better chance of changing their mind. So I'm very strong that expressing anger towards another person is never a good idea. Zeal for justice is a good idea. Challenging injustice directed at me is a good idea. But just getting angry with another person, I don't think adds anything to improving any situation that I know. Now, that doesn't stop people. People do get angry. I fully appreciate that. But I find two things. I don't think it helps. And secondly, because often it just makes the other person angry too. We end up in a shouting match. But secondly, too, one of the most fascinating things about the early monks and nuns, these extraordinary people who lived in the deserts around the Middle East in the 3rd and 4th century, is they were the first psychologists. And they noticed certain connections. That list you just read out was a list of those desires they found welling up in themselves, even though they were living in their cells on their own. But they also noticed connections between them. They noticed that sadness followed anger. And so modern psychology, 1,500 years later, has discovered that depression is often connected to anger. And that anger and depression are connected. Now, sometimes it can be unexpressed anger. Fine. But that's why I'm saying that if you get angry, it's a good idea to express it to somebody else. So don't suppress it. Either redirect it to a kind of zeal for justice, redirect it talking to another person. But, scenes of crowds of demonstrators getting angry with other people, I don't think it adds anything. I think it can lead to violence. It can lead to a kickback from other people. But there appears to be a lot of anger in the world, in local communities, in international groups, and so on. And I just think taking the anger out of these situations might actually help them to improve. But a lot of people disagree with that.
Do you think your viewpoint is over-idealistic and sometimes people need a kick up the butt with an angry crowd shouting at them to do the right thing?
Well, certainly lots of people like to think so. I remain to be persuaded. So my challenge is, I don't believe what I'm saying is idealistic. I think it's the best way to achieve change. I'm not sure that lots of angry people achieves change as much as they'd like to think it does. In my experience, the angry mob usually disperses at some point and leaves some poor person having to negotiate with the authorities that they were angry about in a calmer mood. Most people don't give in to angry mobs. They either run away or they actually use force against them. But they rarely sit down and go, you know what, you're so angry, I'm going to change my mind.
I guess the question to ask yourself is, why am I doing this?
Yes.
Am I getting angry because I think it's going to make a change, or am I doing it because I've slightly lost control of my emotions here, or I'm being performative to win more friends?
And that's where the zeal for justice comes in. It seems to me, having an absolute focused commitment to achieving justice in a situation, which can be done with great emotional force. I'm not denying the need for emotion in this, but it's the right kind of emotion. It's an emotion that's trying to achieve the best outcome. So it's an emotion of perseverance, an emotion of a refusal to give up. It's a feeling that I know I'm right, I'm going to get this done, but leaving aside the anger in achieving that.
The future of humanity lies in the hands of those able to pass on to future generations reason for living and hoping. It's from the Second Vatican Council.
Yes.
How do we give Gen Z a reason to get out of bed?
I think if I look back to a previous era, some 50 years ago, the 60s and 70s were an era of great hope and of optimism. And there's a bit of a difference between hope and optimism that I'll come to in a moment. But what fascinates me is there were plenty of reasons at that time for being very depressed and feeling hopeless. There was the Vietnam War. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we nearly had a nuclear war. There was still a huge amounts of poverty in the world, both in this country and overseas. And yet, the hippies told us we were going to make love, not war. and we were going to live in communes and live happily, and we were going to dispense with all these institutions. Having said that, there was also confidence that the United Nations would start to move towards world peace and the abolition of poverty and so on. So, if you like, why was it that was such an upbeat era? Because there were plenty of reasons, like the verge of nuclear war, to be very depressed. But somehow, the spirit of the age managed to stay hopeful. Now, flip it round to now, and everybody's very gloomy, and everybody tells me that Gen Z is, not hopeful and looks on enviously at their elders who own their houses and have pensions and think, I'll never be able to achieve that, whatever. But actually, there are plenty of countersigns as to why you should be hopeful, just like there were plenty of countersigns 50 years ago why you should be depressed. So now, in the last 25, 30 years, the number of people in absolute poverty in the world has decreased very significantly. This country, by one metric, has halved its carbon emissions in the last 30 years. Now, you can challenge saying, well, actually, we just exported some of our carbon emissions to other countries. But nevertheless, even if you look just narrowly at energy generation, we've done dramatic things to reduce our carbon footprint. So there's quite a lot of reasons to be hopeful now, yet people are not hopeful. So what fascinates me is what generates the spirit of an age? Because it's clearly not the facts. There are plenty of counterfacts to be hopeful or depressed in any era. And so I'm concerned that the reasons that a Gen Z person has for getting out of bed are not sufficiently clear. Namely, they may say, well, it's not worth getting out of bed because we're all doomed. And I say that advisedly. So there was an older person who went into Westminster Abbey and drew the figure 1.5 degrees on Charles Darwin's grave in Westminster Abbey. I mean, strange thing to do. But when asked, it was an act of protest against the failure of governments to do things about climate change. And this woman said, I think we're all doomed. To which I wanted to say, well, why'd you bother? But clearly she didn't think we're all doomed. Otherwise she wouldn't have done that. But she said we're all doomed. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons, people saying, well, we're all doomed. And that's a pretty disincentive to get out of bed. But the fact that people who say that still make protests and still get out of bed shows that at another level, they don't think that's true. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother.
Or at least they have hope.
They do have hope, and that's my point. And therefore, trying to articulate the reasons for living and hoping is really important. And I think the kind of doom scrolling thing, is not helping your generation. And it doesn't help any of our generations, actually. So I think that trying to contain what we feed our souls with is really important. So I don't think people are aware how much what my mind drinks in affects my well-being just as much as what my body drinks in. So we're all used to the idea that we shouldn't drink stuff that's toxic. Too much alcohol will poison us. Too much processed food will make us get fat and so on. We know that, but we've stopped realizing that about the mind and the soul, what we drink in. So I want to say to your generation, please learn to drink in healthier mind food. And you are smart enough to know where to find that, because it's out there as much on the internet as the doom stuff. You can find it. And secondly, you can find it by joining with other people. So one of the best reasons for getting out of bed is because I'm part of a group that's going to be out there along with me. So in the monastery, one of the reasons for getting up in the morning is because I know there's another 20 people who are getting up in the morning to go to church, and I'm going to be there with them. Now, sometimes that's counteracting the negative emotions. So some mornings I'm turning up because I don't want to be seen to not turn up. But that's okay, because that means that on a bad morning, I'll still turn up because I know the other people will be expecting me to. But then on a good morning, I'm turning up because I really feel energized today to turn up. And I suppose it's belonging to those groups that give you a motivation to keep turning up even on the bad days. And that is, where do you find those groups? I think you need to find them. You need to create them if necessary. And we go back to the institutions I spoke about at the moment. Here in this beautiful church in London, every morning, people turn up to our morning service, and then others turn up to our lunchtime service. In any day, about 150 people come along to the church here. And of course, there's more than 150 because they don't necessarily come every day. They may come every couple of days. But there are people who know other people who are going to turn up, and they come from, the mad, frenetic activity of the city into this sanctuary to sit with other people in prayer. And that's a great reason for getting out of bed, because at the end of it, you feel I've really fed my mind with good stuff, and I've done it with other people, and we've supported each other. So I think the truth of life is that without feeding our souls with good stuff, our souls will become thin and unwell. And I don't think your generation has fully appreciated that. And they're starting to under the mental health banner. But I'd want to also add to that the spiritual health banner. That and the classic tradition in the monastic tradition of feeding the soul is what's called, in Latin, Lectio Divina. In English, I call it slow reading. The slow reading of a sacred text is the most wonderful way to feed the soul. So I've read this text 100 times. I know the parable of the Good Samaritan, although I'm always shocked to discover, do you know what the parable of the Good Samaritan says?
I have no idea.
Yeah, exactly. So it's always wonderful when I find this, because have you heard of a group called the Samaritans?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the origin of that is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which tells the story told by Jesus of a man who's walking along the road to Jericho and who falls among thieves, to use the biblical expression, and the thieves beat him up and rob him. And then 3 people come along the road. The first one is a priest who says, "I'm sorry, I'm busy," and walks on the other side. The next one is a Levite who's a devout Jew who comes along and walks on the other side and says, "Sorry, I'm busy." And then the third one who comes along is a Samaritan. Now, the Samaritans were a sect that was, there was great enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans are the bad guys in Jewish tradition. So it's the bad guy who comes along and helps the man who's fallen between thieves, takes him to a local inn and says to the innkeeper, "Look after him, and whatever you have to spend, I'll repay you when I come back." And hence the Good Samaritan, which is a contradiction in terms, because Samaritans are bad in that culture. So, and then it was a priest actually here in London who had the idea of being available for people who are in trouble on the end of a phone. And hence the Samaritans began. But what I think is important is that when I read that story, even though I know it 100 times, I've read it, I don't know how many times in my life and heard it read out, it reminds me of certain truths, which I need to be reminded of regularly. Namely, I can get too busy to notice who needs my help. And that's a pretty important message in life, especially now. And maybe especially for your generation, to start drinking in that kind of mind food with those very simple truths. But the genius of the simple truths is they come through a story, and we can all remember the story. And of course, Jesus' teaching is full of these brilliant parables. So Jewish scholars who are not followers of Jesus, but will tell you that in Jewish culture, Jesus is the greatest teller of parables that they've ever met. And so there is an extraordinary genius in his parables that can sit with you day by day as you read them.
I'm optimistic. I think this idea of putting the cart before the horse is going to wear off. The novelty of these performative acts and people that have never been to the gym or on a long walk in their life doing ice baths and wearing nasal strips and buying NutriBullets and doing cold plunges every day. I think the truth will come along and you know, it will prosper. And there's a bit of faith involved in my optimism, but I see it slowly happening. And I think that hopefully that noise will be washed out by these more fundamental things that we need.
So tell me about the gym culture, because this is something completely alien to me. I mean, I've been into one or two gyms. When I look in, some of them have glass fronts, and you can see people on treadmills. And I look in and I think, oh my God, this looks worse than the Spanish Inquisition. You know, so all this self-punishment going on here. And I'm saying to myself, now this is really interesting. So we do this sort of grinding discipline of the body to an extraordinary degree. And people will proudly show you how much their body has changed through this grinding punishment discipline. And they'll say it makes them feel good, the sort of dopamine released and all of that. But what concerns me is a failure to understand that our minds and our souls are exactly the same. And without that kind of discipline, you will be spiritually impoverished. How do you react to that?
Yeah, there's this sort of continual self-flagellation of proving to people that you can do hard things. And I think it's just easier to quantify than other methods. That's a big part of it. I take a lot of value in doing difficult things, and I think it's important to do so that you're prepared for the challenges that you'll face in life. But it definitely can get to a point where it's not preparing you for something that truly is difficult because it's staged and it's rehearsed. It's not novel. Something like going to the gym. I know plenty of people, including myself at certain points, that get wrapped up in this fantasy of being this warrior, going to the gym 4 times a week and being able to take on any struggle that may be imposed on them. But it's not true, because they're going to an air-conditioned unit where they've got everything they need, they know what to expect, and they're doing the same exercises that they've done the last 2 months straight. So I think at the root of it, it's just that easy performative way of showing people online, I can do these self-punishing things and still stand up strong.
But even without the online thing, people are still turning up to do this stuff. And I suppose my question is, do you think there is awareness? Do you have an awareness that your soul needs as much care as your body?
I think it depends on what you mean by your soul.
So define it the way you define it.
I wouldn't give a definition of the soul because I don't know if I even have a conception of what a soul would be.
So do you buy into the contemporary concern about spirituality?
What do you mean by contemporary concern?
Well, historically, spirituality was identified with the spiritual practices of a particular religion. In contemporary culture, it is a free-floating concept that different people define differently, but it's something to do with paying attention to the non-visible parts of their life that matter. So do you have a sense that the non-physical part of your life needs attention as much as your physical?
Definitely, but I do think I can fall prey to being wrapped up in this left brain mentality.
Yes.
And it's something that you've mentioned in your work, even though you wrote it long before these concepts were being discussed now online in great abundance. And that's the idea. I mean, it goes back to ancient philosophers as well, the difference between work and leisure. And now there's been this shift where I think leisure used to mean not at work. That's the original etymology of it. But now leisure is fueling the work and to be even more plentiful.
Yes.
And I'll hold my hands up now. I can't talk about this in the sense of overcoming this. I do this all the time now still. I love having leisure, not for the sake of relaxing and switching off, but because I know that it's going to prevent burnout and fuel me to work even harder when I do return to work.
Wow, that's a very utilitarian view of leisure. So there is, in the monastic tradition, there is the concept of holy leisure. And I suppose that what the monk mode calls the rather paltry 10 minutes of meditation is a kind of holy leisure. But of course, because as you're saying, this is rather online and it's measured and whatever. So it's not the leisure it could be. But the notion of a time when you're available, in my understanding, available for God to bring a healing spirit to me, just by opening myself to God, but perhaps in less sort of theistic terms, to be just open to this dimension of life that it seems to me more and more people acknowledge is real, which needs attending to and feeding in some way. And as I said, in the monastic tradition, the great feeding is through reading scripture. Now, I'd say to people, well, maybe if you like reading poetry, it seems to me poetry is on the cusp of entering wonderfully into this world, because they take the language and they shift the language to say things that have never been said before in a way that challenges us. And we go, oh, my goodness, that's so true. And yet we don't quite know why it's true because the language is so weird. And yet we're drawn to it like a magnet. And it's giving time to that sort of experience as a holy leisure that seems to me is really important, that it would concern me your generation's missing out on. I remember being 16 and reading some great poetry that affected me deeply. And I've known, because I spent a lot of time as a teacher, I've known other teenagers for whom that's a really important encounter as well. And so I'd want to encourage that kind of holy leisure and to say that's as important as going to the gym. Or does that sound crazy to you?
No, not at all. But I think even so, it's just being cognizant of not falling prey to this cerebral approach of
yes.
Not doing it because it feels great and gives you leisure, but doing it in a pre-planned manner.
Yeah, and it's also the difference between mental health and spiritual health. So mental health is well served by invigorating walks, trips to the gym, connections to other people in, dance clubs, whatever. Those are all great for mental health. But spiritual health is another dimension as well. And I think it's things like poetry, meditation, spiritual reading. These are the food of spiritual health. And I think then I would say, I think your generation is the first generation in 50 years that might be open to understanding that because you've not been inoculated against religion as a child.
I think a lot of it, again, as it always does, time and time again on this podcast, it ties into instant gratification versus long-term gain. Yeah. It's the marshmallow test.
But there's even short-term gain in reading a beautiful poem. You just go, wow. And it's instantly, it instantly feeds you and you the marvel of it.
Yeah.
So it enhances the marvel of life, really.
But even then, I feel like there's more of an upfront cost of being able to understand the poetry and read all of it. Whereas, you'll be shocked by how instantly and easily other forms of gratification can come about. So
yes,
there's more of an upfront cost to achieve these more spiritually enlightening things rather than purely dopaminergic things.
Yes, but it's not, that's why I said I look on in wonder when I look through the plate glass window at the 20 people on treadmills. I'm thinking, this is costing them a great deal of effort. And I'm saying, half that effort is needed to read a good poem. So I'm challenging the the notion that this is all just too difficult. I think it's not too difficult. It's just currently not made available enough to your generation. And that's my concern. And I blame churches for that. I blame schools for that, because as I said at the beginning, we have not adapted to where your generation is to make sure we're bringing you the food you need for the spiritual journey. And that you need the food for the spiritual journey, I believe some of you are starting to understand. There's less understanding of the need for the institutions to adapt to bring you that food, other than in a rather browbeating kind of fundamentalist way. And so I do think there's an interesting almost project how to offer food for the soul to a generation that doesn't know it wants it or doesn't know it needs it. It's like an older generation didn't know that, the way that you eat is going to affect your health in a way that generations do now.
How do you do that? How do you make that pivot from something that's great for your mental health to something that's great for your spiritual health and that transcends everything else that you could experience?
I think that's the challenge, as to how do we adapt to meet that. I mean, what interests me is how most of the online stuff on YouTube and whatever, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me YouTube is now the more serious place in social media.
Yeah.
Is that roughly right?
Definitely.
All the stuff on YouTube that comes from religious traditions at the moment is pretty heavily either apologetics, trying to persuade you why we're right and you're wrong, or it's quite heavily evangelistic, saying, the answer to your question is Jesus or the prophet or Buddha or whatever. And there aren't many places I've found, if any, which can offer you insights about spiritual health that don't come laden with either apologetic or evangelistic frameworks. And that's what I've tried to do in my books, is to offer some of that. But I'm now realizing that we need to create it online, and I'm now too old to do it because it's a different culture. But that there is perhaps a space, which you are partly fulfilling, I think, Elliot, of beginning to offer that kind of food through these kinds of discussions. But I think there is much more to be done, to bring some of the great spiritual resources to bear to people without insisting that it must come with those wider frameworks.
Abbot Christopher Jamison, thank you so much. And thank you for letting us use this magnificent space. What a backdrop for our conversation.
Yes, well, it's St Mary Moorfields Church in the City of London, the only Catholic church in the square mile. And it's a very historic and beautiful place to which everybody's welcome. Lots of people use it as their sanctuary in the city, even if they're not Catholic. And many people come in to light a candle because they have a friend who's in distress and they've said, I'll light a candle for you, which I think is a beautiful example of someone being aware of that spiritual dimension, that they can celebrate it simply by lighting a candle in a church.
Where can people find more of your work if they enjoyed this conversation today?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. I came off social media some time ago for all sorts of reasons. I did it for work and then I didn't need to. So the best thing is to read my books, Finding Sanctuary, Finding Happiness, Finding the Language of Grace, all of which you can find at bad booksellers as well as good ones.